Today is looking at Jesus walking on the water, the story. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, start out with just kind of an overview or a specific scene from Jesus walking on the water. And this is the scene where Jesus leaves the shoreline. He is walking across the water, walking on the water toward his disciples who are in a boat, and it's in the middle of a storm. The disciples see Jesus walking toward them. They think he's a ghost. And then Jesus says to Peter, step over the side of the boat and come to me. And Peter steps over. And for a split couple of seconds, Peter is standing on the water. But then he takes his eyes off Jesus, looks at the storms, and begins to sink. Think about why these stories last. Even though on a most literal level, we know that these things just cannot happen. You take all of the experiences that you've had, not once has anybody seen a human being walk on the water. I can challenge people, people can challenge me. I can try to walk on water. I can try to step in the swimming pool. I can step into the lake. And inevitably, my feet are going to go through the water and I'm going to sink. These stories last for a reason. All of these stories last. Any story that has lasted decades, millennia, decades, centuries, millenniums, all of these stories last because there's truth that comes through them. And part of our responsibility, I think, is to allow truth to come through these stories and not stop at the literal. So when we're kids, a lot of us in Sunday school, we were taught that the story of Jesus walking on the water. We were given the facts of the story. And if we were young enough, we believed the story. We just didn't even question it. Of course, Jesus walked on the water. Jesus could do that. He did miracles. We believed it. Well, once we obtained that story through birth, the birthing of the story into our lives, which is the season of spring, next comes summer. And in summer, it's the season of maintenance. The story just sits with us. As we get toward the end of the summer, most of us have gotten a little bit older. The story has been kind of in the season of summer, and it's now facing the season of autumn, the season of perpetual death. And the season of perpetual death means that we have asked questions at the end of summer, and we have slowly, in a sense, killed the story through asking questions and making observations. People cannot walk on the water. We may even have talked to scientists about density, and been able to calculate, well, this is why Jesus couldn't walk on the water. But at some point, we begin to dismantle the facts of the story. Now, if we don't do anything with that, the story will die. We'll go into the winter season with this story of Jesus walking on the water. The story will be buried under the white blanket of snow, and we will forget about it. We know that the earth is resetting. We know that new things are going to come back. So we know these things, but perhaps with this story, we just bury it and just kind of let it die and let it stay under the winter blanket. But when spring comes up, so when the second season of this story comes into our lives, the story comes back up. And once again, we're kind of forced to deal with it and think about it. Now, perhaps this story came back to you a second time after learning the literal interpretation of the story and then dismissing it as just being nonsense that anybody could walk on the water, that maybe somebody said to you, well, that story teaches us a lesson. That story teaches us about surviving the storm. It teaches us that if we keep our eyes on good, as portrayed by Jesus, something good, that even though there's storms around us, we can walk on the water. And there's all other different lessons that, that people have taken from this story and passed on from this story. But even that is somewhat limiting because we can learn this lesson that, if we keep our eyes on good, what is right, What is Jesus? What is Christ? If we keep our eyes on that, even amidst the storm, we can survive the storm with faith, with hope. So, all of these lessons, but at some point, if we chew on that enough and just kind of be with that, which would be the summer season, just being with it, eventually it's going to become quite unexceptional. We're going to hear enough about walking on the water and enough about, okay, these are the lessons that we can learn. Life kicks in and we realize that, sometimes it's not that simple as, surviving the storm. And we in some ways we give up the ability to look at these as children, and maybe we should, but at the same time, eventually we have to grow up and we have to accept that, okay, the literal interpretation is very limiting, and even some of these lessons can be very limiting. And so, again, we go through this autumn season of perpetual death. We just kind of let the story die, whether we get distracted by other stories or by life, but it just kind of fades out of our mind, just like things do if we don't pay attention to them. Gets buried under the winter for a season, and then spring comes around, and once again, for whatever reason, all of a sudden the story resurfaces. So right now, maybe this story is resurfacing for you. Maybe you haven't thought about this little scene of Jesus walking on the water. And I'm not here to tell you how to interpret. I'm just here to say, look, if stories keep coming up, there's a reason they keep coming up. Take some time and be with them. See what you get out of them. I'm not going to tell you what to get out of them. I'm going to give you some ideas, but be with the story and see what you get. So here's where I'm going to go with kind of the third season of this story. So after you've learned the literal story, like in other words, here are the events, here's literally what the story says. And once you get kind of the pithy sort of lessons from the story, I hope that's not too insulting, but that's kind of the way I look at it. You take the story that's been around for centuries and centuries, and you say, oh, it's about surviving the storms. Well, that to me, that's a little bit pithy. Like I would like to see people even go a little bit deeper with it. So what I'd like to do is go a little bit deeper with it, and I want to look at what water might represent. And we're going to take some time here. So I want to show you this quote by Carl Jung. Carl Jung is one of my heroes. He's probably the individual who has had the biggest impact on me as a psychotherapist in terms of how I view life, how I help people look at the meaning of life, look at all of the existential questions and the discomfort and the stress and how the different tensions in our life. But Carl Jung says this: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And a lot of times in psychology, we use the image of an iceberg. And so this is where we're really focusing on the water in the story. So we look at the iceberg. So you look at the picture of the iceberg on the screen right now, and you'll notice that only a small portion of the iceberg is above the water. And you can see that there's a reflection of the iceberg underneath. And most of the iceberg is buried. And so Carl Jung states, until you make the unconscious conscious, until you bring up the stuff that you're not aware of, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. You'll just kind of accept that, well, this is the way it's supposed to be, instead of believing that you can walk on the water. You can lift the iceberg above the water. So you can kind of see where we're going here with this, the third seasonal cycle of the story of Jesus walking on the water. I want to share something else with you. So just one more thing really quickly. And this is, that was the wrong button there. This is also one of my heroes. This is Father Richard Rohr. And he has an excellent book called Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. And we're going to end with this quote today. But here's what Richard Rohr says about consciousness. One of the great surprises is that humans come to full consciousness precisely by shadow boxing, facing their own contradictions and making friends with their own mistakes and failings. So spend some time with that. It's a very powerful quote, and that's one where we're going to dive into this tomorrow. which is this idea of how is it that humans need to look into the mirror and they need to shadow box with themselves. They need to face their own contradictions, and that will, in effect, allow them symbolically to walk on the water. Namaste, my friends.